My name is Marjorie Jackson, and I'm 41 years old. If you had asked me a year ago whether money could quietly dismantle a marriage, I would have said no. I would have believed that financial problems showed up loudly, with slammed doors and raised voices, not slowly, not in the subtle way water works its way into cracks you never noticed until the damage is already done. I know better now. Our house used to feel steady. Not perfect, not storybook, but dependable. A blended family with a rhythm that mostly held together. Shared dinners, overlapping schedules, and two teenage boys trying to make sense of what adulthood was supposed to look like. My biological son, Caleb, was 17 then. He was cautious by nature, thoughtful, the kind of kid who researched everything before committing to it and still hesitated at checkout. My stepson Ryan was 19, and his opposite in almost every way. Confident, impulsive, convinced that money was there to be spent and that things had a way of working themselves out. They both lived with us. They both worked part-time retail jobs at the mall, earning the same minimum wage, working similar shifts. Ryan had started first, mostly because he was older and impatient for spending money. When Caleb finally got hired, I made a choice I didn't announce or explain. I quietly kept 30% of his paycheck. I told him it was non-negotiable, that it was about learning responsibility, that adulthood came with structure, whether you welcomed it or not. He didn't love it, but he didn't push back. He trusted me. What I didn't tell him was what I was really doing. I wasn't just holding on to his money. I was saving it. Every paycheck, that 30% went into a separate account. On weeks when I could manage it, I added a little of my own. I didn't do this because Caleb asked. I did it because I remembered being his age, thinking freedom meant spending everything the moment it hit my hands. I wanted him to step into adulthood with something solid under him, something that made the world feel less fragile. My husband, Thomas, knew I was taking the money. We'd talked about it early on. We kept our finances mostly separate, a choice rooted in a messy financial history he rarely discussed. I respected that boundary. He knew what I was doing for Caleb and didn't object, at least not then. Caleb knew I was taking money, but not how much or why. I kept the details vague on purpose. Part of me wanted the reveal to feel like a gift. Part of me didn't want to over-explain something that felt instinctively right. Months passed. Paychecks came and went. The account grew quietly. Then Caleb started talking about cars. Nothing flashy, used, reliable, something that would get him to school and work without breaking down on the highway. He talked about insurance, gas, maintenance. He was thinking ahead in a way that made my chest ache with pride. One night we sat at the kitchen table with notebooks spread between us. He told me how much he thought he'd saved. I let him calculate, let him sigh when he realized it wouldn't stretch as far as he'd hoped. That's when I told him. I explained the account. Every paycheck, every transfer, every dollar he hadn't known existed. For a moment he just stared at me, his mouth opened, then closed. I worried he might be angry, that he'd feel deceived. Instead, he jumped up so fast, his chair scraped loudly across the floor, and wrapped his arms around me. "Mom," he laughed, his voice breaking just slightly. "That's insane." He hugged me so tightly, I almost lost my balance. I joked about hoping he'd forgive me for being controlling. He said if I hadn't done it, he would have spent it all on electronics and junk food and regretted it later. That moment, his trust and gratitude felt like confirmation that I'd done the right thing. I wish it had stopped there. Ryan heard about the car fund 2 days later. I didn't realize he was in the hallway when Caleb mentioned it, excited and careless. I noticed when Ryan laughed. It wasn't amused or happy. It was sharp. "So that's why he always acts broke," he said, "because you're hiding his money." My stomach tightened. Thomas came into the room, his face unreadable. He didn't yell or accuse me outright. But later that night, after the boys were in their rooms, he sat across from me on the couch with his arms crossed. "You didn't think that might look like favoritism?" he asked. I reminded him calmly that I'd never stopped him from doing something similar for Ryan, that he knew exactly what I was doing, that the boys were at different ages and different stages. He didn't argue those points directly. Instead, he talked about fairness, about balance, about how Ryan might feel. That was the first time I felt something cold settle between us. The days that followed were tense. Ryan grew quieter, more distant. Thomas started watching my interactions with Caleb like he was searching for proof of wrongdoing. I told myself it was temporary, that blended families had growing pains, that once emotions cooled, reason would return. But one night, lying awake beside a man who suddenly felt far away, I realized this wasn't really about money. It was about entitlement, about unspoken expectations turning into demands, about how quickly love gets questioned when someone believes they're being denied something they deserve. If part one was about quiet choices, part two was about noise, the kind that rattles your nerves, the kind that turns dinner into a battleground and arguments into loops you can't escape. Thomas waited 3 days before bringing it up again. We were washing dishes, the TV murmuring when he said casually that maybe we should help Ryan too.
Just to keep things balanced. I dried my hands slowly.
Balanced how? He suggested splitting the car fund, or at least part of it. Splitting Caleb's money. Money you saved while he was living under our roof, he corrected. That was when confusion turned into anger. I reminded him the money came from Caleb's paychecks, that Ryan had never been required to save anything, that Thomas had known all of this from the beginning. He sighed like I was being deliberately difficult. It's not about technicalities, he said. Ryan feels like you care more about Caleb.
That word hit harder than I expected.
I said I cared about both boys, but caring didn't mean pretending they were the same. He didn't like that answer. The conversations kept resurfacing. At dinner, Ryan made half-joking comments. Must be nice having a secret bank account. Caleb froze. Thomas didn't shut it down. Friends weighed in, family weighed in. Even my own mother asked gently if I'd thought about Ryan's feelings. I felt like the rules kept changing, and I was always the one out of step. It escalated when Thomas brought up college. My parents had promised to help Caleb with tuition, long before I married Thomas. Ryan doesn't have that, Thomas said. So when you give Caleb a car fund too, how is that fair? I told him my parents helping their grandson didn't obligate me to compensate his son. You're his stepmother, he shot back. You're supposed to want him to succeed. I did want him to succeed, but not at the cost of taking from my own child. Caleb overheard more than I wanted. One evening he asked quietly if they were trying to take the money. I told him no immediately. He said he didn't want to cause problems. That was when I realized how dangerous things had become, when a 17-year-old felt responsible for adult emotions. Thomas's frustration boiled over soon after. One night after Ryan slammed his door, Thomas accused me of tearing the family apart. I laughed, not because it was funny, but because it felt unreal. By not stealing from my own son, I asked. By refusing to compromise, he said. That was the first time he packed a bag. He said he needed space and went to his sister's, leaving behind a house that felt hollow. The silence that followed was worse than the arguing. Ryan barely spoke to me before he left with Thomas. Caleb tiptoed around the house, trying not to ask questions. Friends kept texting, offering advice I hadn't asked for. I lay awake at night replaying everything, wondering how protecting one child had turned into an accusation of neglecting another, wondering when fair stopped meaning reasonable and started meaning take from one to satisfy another. A week after Thomas left, he called me. His tone was colder, more deliberate. I've been thinking, he said. If we're going to fix this, you need to make a gesture. A gesture? I asked for Ryan, he said. Something concrete, something that shows you're serious about treating them equally. My stomach dropped. I knew before he even finished speaking that whatever he was about to ask would change everything. I didn't sleep the night Thomas called. Not because he'd raised his voice. He hadn't. Not because he'd threatened me outright. He hadn't done that either. It was the calmness in his tone that unsettled me. The way his words sounded practiced, like he'd already decided how this conversation was supposed to end. The next morning, he called again. I've thought it through, he said. If you really want us to move forward, you need to buy Ryan a car, the same kind Caleb's getting. Same price, same everything. For a moment, I was genuinely speechless. You want me to buy your son a car? I said slowly. With money saved from my son's paychecks. Yes, Thomas replied as if the logic were flawless. That's the only way this stops feeling unequal. Something inside me snapped, not explosively, but cleanly, like a rope finally giving way after being pulled too tight for too long. That's not equality, I said. That's punishment. He didn't like that. You're choosing sides, he said sharply. You always have. I reminded him again that Ryan was 19, that he'd had more time, more freedom, and no restrictions on how he spent his money, that Caleb had sacrificed part of every paycheck without complaint. Thomas dismissed it all with a single sentence. He feels like he doesn't belong. That word again, belong. As if belonging could be purchased. As if forcing sameness could replace fairness. I told him no. Firmly, clearly, without apology. That's when the demands escalated. 3 days later, Thomas called me in the middle of the afternoon. I could hear his sister's TV in the background. He sounded irritated. Like I was the one being unreasonable for not anticipating his next move. If you can't afford the car, he said, then maybe you should ask your parents to help Ryan with college. I actually laughed out loud before I could stop myself. You want me to ask my parents, I said, to pay for your son's college tuition? Yes, he replied. They're already helping Caleb. It's only fair. Only fair. That phrase had lost all meaning. They're his grandparents, I said. Ryan barely knows them. That's not the point, Thomas shot back. If you cared about Ryan the same way, you'd at least try. I ended the call before he could say anything else. I sat there afterward, phone still in my hand, staring at the wall. It felt like I was watching my marriage from a distance, finally seeing it clearly for the first time. It was about control, about rewriting reality until Thomas got the outcome he wanted, about using guilt, pressure, and emotional blackmail to force compliance. That night, I talked to a lawyer. Just a consultation, I told myself. Just information. But the moment the word divorce was spoken out loud, something in my chest loosened instead of tightening. A week later, I had papers drawn up. Sending them felt surreal. My hand shook as I pressed send, a wave of relief and grief crashing into each other all at once. Thomas's reaction was immediate. What the hell is this? He yelled over the phone. You're seriously doing this? Yes, I said quietly. I am. You're blowing up our marriage over money, he snapped. No, I replied. I'm ending it because you're willing to hurt my son to prove a point. He called me selfish, accused me of being a terrible stepmother, said I'd never really accepted Ryan as family. Each word landed hard, but instead of breaking me, they confirmed something I'd been avoiding. No explanation would ever be enough for him. I hung up. The house felt strangely peaceful afterward. Empty, yes, but calm. Like the silence after a storm, when the air finally clears. Caleb noticed immediately. We sat on the couch that evening, the TV on mute, neither of us really watching it. Are you and Thomas? He asked. Yes, I said. We're getting divorced. He was quiet for a long moment. I'm sorry, he said finally. I pulled him into a hug. You don't have anything to be sorry for. That night I realized something important. I wasn't choosing between my husband and my son. Thomas had already made that choice when he decided my love had to be proven by sacrifice, and I wasn't willing to sacrifice my child. The divorce didn't end with fireworks. There were no dramatic courtroom speeches, no last-minute apologies, no cinematic reconciliation where everything suddenly made sense again. It ended with paperwork, stacks of it, pages that reduced years of shared life into signatures and dates, meetings with lawyers who spoke in calm, neutral tones while my stomach twisted into knots, long pauses where Thomas and I sat across from each other, avoiding eye contact, like strangers who happened to know each other's worst habits. When it was finally done, when the last document was signed and the door to the conference room closed behind me, I felt something unexpected. Relief. Not happiness, not triumph. Driving home that day, I realized how long I'd been living with tension humming in the background. Like a low electrical buzz you don't notice until it finally switches off. The house was quiet when I walked in. No slammed doors, no accusations hanging in the air, just stillness. Caleb was at school. I sat at the kitchen table alone and let myself breathe. The weeks that followed were strange but steady. Thomas got his share, I got mine. Everything was divided cleanly, legally, and with far less drama than I'd braced myself for. Ryan chose to stay with his father. I wished him well, genuinely, but I didn't chase. I was done trying to earn my place through sacrifice. Caleb and I settled into a new rhythm. We talked more about school, about work, about things that had nothing to do with money or conflict. I could see the weight lifting from him slowly, his shoulders relaxing now that he wasn't walking on eggshells in his own home. He bought his car, a reliable used sedan, nothing flashy, and saved the rest of his money just like he said he would. Watching him make those choices felt like quiet vindication. One night, while we were cleaning up after dinner, he smiled at me and said, "I'm glad it's just us now." I didn't answer right away. I just nodded, because I felt it too. Life didn't suddenly become perfect. There were lonely evenings, moments where I caught myself reaching for my phone out of habit, only to remember there was no one to call. But the peace outweighed the loss. Months later, when I wasn't looking for anything, when I'd stopped thinking of myself as someone who needed to fix or replace what was gone, I met Daniel. A friend introduced us over coffee. No pressure, no expectations, just conversation that flowed easily, like we'd known each other longer than we had. He listened more than he spoke. He didn't rush, and most importantly, he didn't see my boundaries as obstacles. His ex-girlfriend showed up briefly in our lives, resentful, sharp-edged, clearly uncomfortable with the fact that Daniel had moved on. But this time, I didn't spiral. I didn't compete. Daniel handled it calmly, firmly, and without dragging me into unnecessary drama. That alone told me everything I needed to know. When Daniel met Caleb, I watched carefully. He didn't try to play dad, didn't force jokes or authority. He showed up as himself, respectful, curious, kind. They talked about school, movies, and plans for the future. And somehow, that was enough. Looking back now, I understand something I didn't before. Fairness isn't about making everything identical. Love isn't proven through sacrifice that leaves one person diminished. And protecting your child isn't favoritism. It's responsibility. Some storms don't pass on their own. Some only end when you stop standing in the rain. And walking away wasn't failure. It was the moment I chose peace.